Hi everybody, welcome back. We're now into mixing and MIDI effects. I really hope that a lot of you will find that this is a lot of fun. The most important part to take into account, of course, is that within Logic you've got thousands of different choices, and don't let that overwhelm you. Just simply try things at this point. Of course, at this stage, these are the basics, and so I'm hoping that not only is this fun, but it's, hopefully, designed to be easy as well. The idea is that when we start looking at something like this, we're going to, look at several modules later on, and we're really going to delve into these parameters, and we're going to study these parameters and a lot of these effects that we're talking about. But as of right now, I just want you to kind of try to mess around with them, try to use them, and see if you can link them into your systems. So as of right now, if we just talk about what we've done up to this point, we've got our drum kit, we've got our retro synth that we've set up. We set up a nice little synth part with alchemy that was basically from this flute part, essentially, right? We've got this weird, dirty, drive drum, part that essentially we've created, and this is coming from a bass, which is really interesting, of course, because they're drums, but it's creating this overdrive. So there are no rules. We just kind of messed around and tried to see what we could come up with, and that was an accident, of course, and it sounds great, right? The other thing, of course, is we're simulating the B3. Remember, as we started the track when we got together last week, we had talked about being able to put a piano, a B3, whatever we decide we want to put over the top of it. So I started with the piano and put that Bosendorfer, and now in this case, I've got the Hammond. And so let's just talk about some of the things that we could do now when we start mixing. This is very similar to what we were doing before. You're going to see that this is going to be a product of repetition, especially when it comes to mixing your product. So to open the mixer in Logic, Command 2, or simply hit X. With the mixer open, start with balancing the amplitude levels. So make sure that we're looking here, keeping everything at a fairly low level. Most importantly, making sure your stereo out is set to unity gain. We don't want to go up or down on our fader in that case. I think it's really wise for some of you, and I do appreciate those screenshots. Having this screenshot is really important, and so if I was to see this, as you could see, you might be able to point out that I have no panning, for example, stuff like that. That would be really easy for me to note and give you some notes and stuff like that, right? The separation, now we want to make sure that in our pan pot we've got some separation, and so I'm going to kind of show you what I've put together as we keep building our track. So in electronic music, obviously we may want to start looking at some of this movement to create interest, and so one of the things I like to look at is automation, and automation is very, very easy to do. So most importantly, if you don't have a DAW that has access to automation, at some point you will. So in this case, just use it as hypotheticals and at least kind of know that that exists. The idea of automation is simply motion of sound, and so as you see anything on the timeline, you can move whatever you see on the computer screen. Faders, if you decide it be panning or whatever you want. So remembering that the next step, the next level would be using automation, and automation controls are located in the same area above the pan pot, just right up here. And once you pick them, make sure that you use the latch function. When you use latch, what you're going to be able to do is write everything that you're doing, and anything before that or after that will be able to just continue writing. So latch is going to be probably the most important part that you note on that case. And then once you're done with latch, make sure that you have access to read. If you don't hit read and you leave it on latch, then basically you're just going to keep re-recording everything that you do through each pass. So make sure that once you're done, you hit read, and it's really, really simple. And I'll show you how to do that, of course, here in a minute. As you can see here, that's what it looks like when it's in latch. It'll turn orange. And then once you're done, of course, change back to read and it will turn green. The area we focus on this module will be the MIDI effects section. And this is where we can find our arpeggiator, chord trigger, modifier, modulators, on and on. And typically, especially for me in dance production and hip hop, the arpeggiator and chord trigger are huge for me. The chord trigger, especially in terms of house. It's where all the MIDI effects are located, and then in that sense that, as you can see here, the MIDI effects are right above your input and right above your audio effects. You're only going to have access to MIDI effects, of course, on MIDI channels and software instruments. And so something that's really fun for many of us is that you'll see that a lot of DAWs will have different MIDI effects. And so every single DAW has similar MIDI effects, but they're all a little bit different. And I think that there's something to note about that too. So if you're using Ableton Live, you will have a chord trigger, but it's going to be in a completely different world. The arpeggiator is going to be completely different. The same is true for FL. The same is true for Pro Tools. So when you talk about MIDI effects, just note that these are concepts. It's not just exclusive to Logic, but I have to admit, the arpeggiator in Logic, especially the arpeggiator, is in a lot of hits, I've got to tell you. So in the sense of the MIDI software plugins, the ones that we've used up to this point, the drum kit, Alchemy, Retro Synth, and the vintage B3, right? Plus we had, a little bit of fun with the piano. Try to add some MIDI effects. Try to add plugins to your tracks to add more depth. Remember, EQ is a plugin, as we were talking in the last module. So if you put EQ on each individual track, I think it's really wise. Try to see what you can do to balance your mix a little bit better. I'm going to roll through here on this mix. I'll go quickly, of course, so I can get out of your way, obviously. But most importantly, you can kind of see some of the things that I'm doing to try to heighten our track and just to subtly make it a little bit better, right? Many times I use the arpeggiator and the chord trigger for interesting melody and chordal interest, and you'll hear the arpeggiator really helps with our bass line. You'll see the arpeggiator really helps with some of our melodies too. It's really, really cool. Super, super easy to use, and what you'll find is it just kind of gets things, dancing a little bit better. You'll see what I mean when I start using it. The minimum 5 effects on your MIDI loop production, of course, as you could see here, we've got 5 effects just, quickly and just what we started with. So please make sure that you have at least 5. I had a couple that turned in maybe 1 or 2, or I wasn't able to actually see some of the effects. Like I'd mentioned to you before, just make sure that you do show me that you can prove that. The only way that you're going to be able to prove that, of course, is to be able to take a screenshot. So once you've put everything up, you've got everything that you like, rebalance the levels, get everything, the panning, the plugins, everything the way that you like it, and then bounce that down so I've got an MP3, and then also make sure that I've got a screenshot of your mix so I can see something like this. For those that basically used GarageBand or anything else, essentially what you had done was perfect. As you saw, I gave you notes on that too, so it was that worked out great. And I do apologize, it's going to take a couple more screenshots obviously, but you can at least prove obviously you're using what you're using. The most important part for me is that I can see what you're doing. In this sense too, it's we run the risk. We definitely want to make sure that you are the ones that are doing the work. And so, if you're taking screenshots, showing me what you're doing, from step to step, essentially, that makes me feel a lot more comfortable that it's you doing that work, of course, right? So make sure you are the ones that are, of course, doing it. I hope. In this case, then bouncing an MP3 file, screenshot, and we're going to be good to go. And that's what I'm going to be looking for on Wednesday. And so hopefully it's super, super easy. Now, most importantly then, let me just kind of roll through what I'm looking for. Now, we started with our drums. So here's what we've got on our drum set. Remember, we could shape our drums, no problem, right? Now, just shaping the drums, you could see just in real time, that really helps, right? What if we want to make sure that the drums are coming through a nice little room? Well, maybe what we could do is insert a reverb. Later on, I'll give you some, other tricks in terms of making this sound, hopefully a little more realistic. But in this case, I'm going to insert on the track in itself a nice little space. So where do we want the drums to be? Well, maybe in this case, think of it in terms of a medium hall or a medium room, nice little drum room or something like that, right? I'll just put it in a percussion room. Kind of livens things up a little bit, just a touch. But with that, I feel that, having access to these effects, it, obviously can really help us make some of these sounds separate them, self out a little bit better, right? So as we went back to it, another thing I'd like to point out again, that it doesn't necessarily have to be drums or acoustic drums. So as you can see here, we've got our drum kit, right? Nothing to it. Now we know how to shape that drum kit. But some of you are working in hip-hop, some of you are working in EDM. I'm the same boat. One of the things I want to show you is something that you might be able to do now is coming into maybe a drum synth. Or one of my favorite is Ultrabeat down here on the bottom. So if you just simply hit stereo, you'll see Ultrabeat. Now that looks kind of scary, right? But there's nothing really scary about it. It's just exactly what you've been used to dealing with. On the left-hand side, we have our samples. And as of right now, you can see here, the only samples I have loaded are just a bunch of sine waves. So if I actually want this to work, we've got to load this in. So if anybody wants to put any of these hip-hop drums into Ultrabeat, just simply come up to the top and populate your drums. So in the drum kit, in my case, I'm going to just simply hit maybe down-tempo kit. Now the down-tempo kit is going to link into the MIDI information that I had on those drums, on the acoustic drums before, and now we should be able to lock into some of these samples, like maybe the wood kick or the snare. Let's just see what happens. Now that sounds hip-hop now, comparative to what we had before, right? And not to take away from acoustics, of course, but this is a really wonderful way to get yourself, that nice swing. Maybe potentially what you could do is grab from acoustic kits and then put, electronic kits over the top of it. I do it all the time. So let's say, for example, we really like it. Maybe you could potentially use that throughout because it really does add a nice little element. Food for thought. Gets a nice little punch, doesn't it? We'll keep going. Let's look at what happened here with the muted bass when we set up this muted bass. One of the things that I've got as I hit Command 2, we've got access to these MIDI effects. And so on this muted bass, essentially, what I did was I called up this arpeggiator in our MIDI effects. All the arpeggiator is going to do is just simply move this pattern around just a little bit in a note order. So as you can see, there's just a subtle pattern that's going to be moving in this case, just simply based on what I've picked here on the rate. And in this case, this is the note order that we are going to pick on this arpeggiation. If we decide we wanted to change the variation, just think of these as simply settings, or the octave range. We can simply just do that by hitting these toggles. But let me show you the difference of what happens to this bass line when I add an arpeggiation. Right? Listen here. Now let me lock in the arpeggiation, and what it's going to do is it's going to move around in basically a chordal structure. And so in this case, as each note hits, because it's not playing multiple notes at the same time, it's just going to play the rhythm. So it's going to sound like you're essentially playing a bass line. Check it out. Without. Can you feel how that creates a really nice subtle groove? It really makes things sound very, very live. And all we've really done is created an arpeggiation effect, which is essentially, in this case, just kind of jumping notes around just a little bit. It's creating a rhythmic effect. It's almost like a delay. Another thing that I did on this muted bass is I added just a touch of compression. Exactly the same way that you've been trained to do it. We set the distortion to soft. The same idea like I was telling you before. We're going to have modules dedicated to compression only. And so as of right now, I'm just hoping that you'll just kind of come in here, mess around with things, just see what you can find. Hopefully not feeling like you're going to blow up your system or anything like that. We're not going to be afraid of anything, essentially. Just start picking some of these parameters and see what happens. In this case, this is vintage FET, but we've got access to a bunch of different ones. This was just simply the one that I liked at the time. I felt like it kind of jumped out a little bit better, right? And hopefully you can perceive the same thing too. So as I take that muted bass, as we've got our drums, as we've got everything set, now I'm going to start looking at this, hopefully a really nice melody line that we've created. I did the same thing on this melody line. I called up the arpeggiation. The melody is kind of doing its thing. Every once in a while it will hit multiple notes at the same time. But to get it to kind of move around just a little bit within the rhythmic elements of what we have in 4/4, you can see here the rate at a 1/16th beat of 4/4, it's going to work perfectly to the tempo that we have here. And in the case of the tempo we've got at 100 beats per minute, So that perfect rate will hopefully line things up. And as you can see here, I'm using the same rate here, hopefully to create a nice cohesion between the bass and that melody line. Watch what happens. It's kind of neat. The other aspect is just to kind of go back to what we had done in our processing before. I called up the space designer. So we put a nice little dream hall over the top of this blue sky, but I'm going to take that away so we can perceive the difference. And I also used a nice little compressor just to kind of help things out just a little bit. So in this case, let me just kind of dial this in a little bit before we get going. Now let's see what we've got for our nice melody, or our quintessential pinnacle. Now that change in compressor really brought out some qualities in our mix, of course, right? The other thing, of course, I wanted to bring out, of course, is some of the reflections. And so I'm going to take that space designer and add it. And the other thing that I had done here is I panned that off to the left. Noting here in this case that I've got my basses set to the middle, I've got my drums set to the middle. There's a lot of things that are owning the center of our stereo field. So now I'm going to take that blue sky, I'm going to pan that to the left, and we'll see what we've got now. The last thing that we had put together, of course, aside from our compressor, aside from just a touch of EQ, now in this case the EQ that they gave us, we're not going to have that, of course. We're going to do just the opposite. Let's cut what we won't need. So let's analyze it. Okay, now our arpeggiation effect. We haven't used it yet. Linking it into exactly what we had done on the bass line, check out the difference. Isn't that great? Very, very subtle stuff. So as far as the note order, obviously in this case from bottom to top, but if I wanted to go from top down, we could just change that around. Let me just kind of show you some of the things that you can do to create, some subtle differences in your arpeggiation. Very, very interesting stuff. And so now I can almost get, let's just say, a strum pattern. Imagine if you had maybe a guitar track or something like that. A lot of these things that we're doing here could lead you into making, your software instruments sound, very, very similar to actually playing some of, obviously some of those strum patterns, which are very difficult to do in MIDI, of course, right? So hopefully that helps you as far as your arpeggiation fun and things like that. But as you can see now, I've got this really, really interesting pattern with blue sky, with the muted bass, with our drums. All of those subtleties are going to really make this separate out. Right? The other thing, of course, is when we started adding some of the pretty stuff, I always like to have maybe a little bit of, some dirt, maybe something that's not so pretty. So in this case, what we put together is this kind of distorted drum thing happening, just to kind of sit in the back. Now, in order for us to achieve this, we're using a hard techno remix within a bass sound. Now, remember, we could go back to those same tricks, and we could use ultra bass, or we could use ultra beat, and we could use, obviously in this case, maybe our drum synth, but the bass, in this case, just, using that bass synth, we might be able to, come up with something kind of cool. In this case, this is something that I liked about it. I liked this to be a little bit glitchy and a little bit dirty. Sometimes I'll go and change plugins because I want it to be better. In this case, I'm using this plugin because I want that dirt and that grit, maybe almost some of that digital dropout. Another way that we're achieving that is just through some overdrive. So we could maybe make this even more distorted if we wanted to just by simply turning up our drive levels. And I'm sure many of you have heard that, especially in house music, especially in hardcore hip hop. I hear that a lot. This, overdriven, right? And that's on purpose. Now, one of the things I love is, of course, hearing that sound and then having this really nice, pristine vocal over the top of it. Now, that's one of the things that, obviously your training will lead you into, is this using distortion when you want it and then using purity of tone when you don't want it, of course, right? So let's listen to what we've got up to this point. I think you're going to love it. Not too bad, right? Interestingly enough, we've got almost 3 different kits working at the same time with 3 different, kick drums, snares. A big part of electronic music is layering too, so definitely don't be afraid of having multiple drums, playing at the same time. I do it all the time. In fact, multiple kicks. It's a daily practice for most of us. Another one that we want to look at, of course, is remember when we started with that emotional piano. The initial piano didn't sound so great, of course, remember? So we changed it to the Bosendorfer. Then we decided we were going to change it to that B3 sound. And so let's just hear what we've got here on our B3. Got a nice little part going. Right. Noting too, I've got that panned off to the right. So I've got our blue sky melody to the left, the organ to the right. You can kind of see in terms of my panning, if I hit Command 2, there's not much to it. I don't have a bunch of tracks going on. We just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tracks essentially, so stereo 12, with 2 pan pots moving from the left and moving to the right. And so hopefully that will help you, create some type of a balance in that side. But you could see that if I was to have everything panned over to the left, obviously, we're going to have our stereo mix leaning. So be careful. We'll make sure that we've got everything set and balanced. We should be, be good to go as far as, at least in terms of our, pan pot balance and our stereo balance. Here's our B3 that we've picked. If you wanted to change tone, all of these stops are going to create tone. So if I open all of these up, you're going to hear this get really distorted and really open. As you can see here, this is more or less a preset that they give you. If you wanted to change the presets, you could. But I like to just kind of mess around and see what we can come up with in terms of tone. Okay, so we'll say we've got, something kind of happening there. Now, another thing that might be kind of nice is let's just call up maybe an arpeggiation and see what we can do. Now, again, I'm just going back to what we had before, trying to link in that cohesion of that rate. 1/16th, having the note order from bottom to top, and then keeping that same variation, simply for cohesion, right? So as we could hear that bass, or the B3, isn't that beautiful? Watch what happens when we put all these together. You're going to find we've got ourselves a monster. Isn't that great? So we're definitely making this track dance a lot better than what we had before. So just going back, we didn't really do too much, but what we did do, of course, really added some wonderful elements. Now, the last thing that I wanted to kind of point out in this case is this, that maybe potentially what we could do is have certain things pan from one side to the next. And so looking at automation, and this is the first time we've looked at this, I'd love it if you tried it. If you've got the capability to do it, great. In this case, of course, obviously, if you don't have access to a DAW, if we can't get into our labs, it's really hard for me to require this, but I would love for you to try to put in some automation to your track. So in the case of automation and motion of sound, let me just kind of show you how this works. So let me go back over here, and this is where our automation channel is going to be, and you can see where it says read. So now I'm in the mode of latch. Once I'm in latch, anything that you see here in our edit area is going to be moving. And so in this case then, if I'm moving from one to whatever I decide to move to, if I'm panning anything, it's going to follow that movement once I play that back. Let me show you what happens. So as you can see here, I was panning blue skies. All I was doing is just moving back and forth from one side to the other. Of course, if you've got headphones, it's really easy to hear. Now, if I was to take and hit return back to the beginning of this spot, if you go up here to the top, I'm going to be able to see all of that automation that I've just written, basically, right? So as far as our automation mode and everything that I've got here now, I should have access to being able to see my view. And so now if I've got, let's say, my read, you can see all of the parameters we've created are moving. But most importantly, if you look up here to the top, you'll be able to see those modes that we've written in. That's just this little guy here. You see where it's got the dots. Many, working in FL Live, you'd say, how can I actually write that in? Logic's no different. They're all exactly the same. And so in order for us to see that mode, you're going to see here that we would come into our volume controls, or we would come into our pan pot controls, or whatever we've got put together. And you can see it's located here on the bottom. So now I can see pan, and I can see all the pan movements that I've just created. So remember then, if you don't like something, then just simply drag over it and decide that you want to make it something different. Or if you wanted to clean it up a little bit, you could do that. And as you can see here, basically what I'm doing then is if we were to go back and run this, watch the pan pot. Every parameter is able to be recorded. You can do anything in time. And so if you see something on the computer screen, for example, if you see alchemy here, and let's say, for example, you wanted to move a filter or any of these modes, if you feel like this is really doing some fun stuff, then utilize it. Watch what happens. Or watch what happens when I hit these dots as it's moving in time. Essentially what we're doing is that we're creating crossfades between multiple parameters at the same time. So you're creating elements that really no one else can do, essentially, unless they have the tools that you have. And so as I roll this, and as anything that I've got in time, let's say you like exactly what you're hearing there within what we've got on Blue Skies. Let's go back to the beginning again. And now I'm going to hit latch. As long as I don't hit the pan pot again, it won't record the pan pot, but it will allow me to record something else over the top of it. So now in this case, I'm going to record these movements of the crossfade of the envelope 1 simply by hitting these parameters here. Watch what happens. I'm now in latch, so anything that I see here within the parameter of this Blue Sky alchemy is going to be recorded. Check it out. Okay, now just imagine then, we're happy with it. I'm going to go back to it. I'm going to hit read. Everything that we just had done within alchemy now will be 100%. Check it out. And of course, I'm not doing anything. You can see me moving my mouse in other spots. This has all been recorded. Isn't that great? So now we've got everything set. We're totally happy with the automation that we've created. And you can see the parameters that we wrote in real time and all the pick points. And so obviously you can write it in if you decide that you want to write it in. But most importantly, I think that you're going to find that when you have a control surface and you map the control surface, or in this case, I'm mapping it to my laptop or a computer, you're going to find that using your ear is going to be very, very wise. And so in this sense, you can see I've got many parameters that have been read, pan pots, in terms of alchemy, a bunch of filters and things like that. So now I've been able to just, with one track and automation, really create some motion and some movement of what we've created. So in that sense, let me just kind of show you what we've got. And there we have it. Obviously just the beginnings, of course, and well on our way to something that we're very, very proud of. So most importantly, now that once everything is set, we're happy with where everything is at, obviously we can go back, we can start looking at the most important part, how we're going to be able to turn this in. So make sure that you've got that side set to your bounce. Bounce your track out, no big deal, right? Coming to your stereo out, we can bounce it, or up on the top, just simply hit File, Bounce, Project or Section. Once everything is set, we've got everything to our MP3, 320, all the way open. Use best encoding. Don't filter your frequencies below 10, of course. Hit OK, we should be good to go. Make sure that it is all directed exactly where you want it to go. That's usually the issue, right? So once we're all set, we've got everything where we want it. You should have everything that, obviously you've ever wanted to do. The idea now, of course, is we're getting closer and closer to total control. Everybody's going to want, something a little bit different in terms of your result. But when it comes down to it, you're going to see that you've got all of the tools that you would possibly need in order to do what you need in the audio world. I hope that helps. Make sure you let me know if you have any questions, guys. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.